History likes to remember the Old South in two ways: the grand, white-pillared mansions of the masters, or the back-breaking labor of the fields. But there is a third history, one whispered in the dark, hidden in the spaces between what a man wants and what a man fears. It began on a Tuesday morning in 1839. A body was pulled from the silt of the Savannah River. He was a son of Georgia's elite, weighted down by stones, his back carved with a single, terrifying word: forgiveness. Within 18 months, the four most powerful dynasties in the state would be brought to their knees. Not by an army, not by a rebellion of fire and steel, but by one woman who understood that the system designed to cage her body had created men who were already prisoners of their own appetites. Her name was Delilah, and this isn't just a story of survival, it is the chronicle of a surgical, psychological execution. In the humid heat of June 1837, the arrival of Delilah at the Belhaven estate was a transaction cloaked in deceptive simplicity. Jonathan Merrick, a man of rising political stature and Yale-educated intellect, believed he was merely acquiring a high-value domestic asset to bolster his household's prestige. The legal documents described her with a clinical, almost unnerving specificity, noting her quadroon appearance and refined manners. Yet one detail stood out as a silent alarm. A court order from Savannah mandated she be sold at least 50 miles away, a distance requirement that usually hinted at a history of defiance or disruption. However, blinded by his own arrogance and the need to provide his wife, Eleanor, with a sophisticated assistant, Merrick ignored the warnings. He saw a tool to manage correspondence and social optics, never imagining he was inviting a predator into his sanctuary. Delilah did not enter the plantation with the loud friction of a rebel. She arrived with the terrifying stillness of a master architect. From her first day at Belhaven, she functioned as a shadow, moving through the high, ceilinged rooms with a grace that made her nearly invisible to those who claimed to own her. While Eleanor Merrick marveled at the new servant's competence in French and needlework, Delilah was performing a much more dangerous labor. She was mapping the emotional architecture of the Merrick family, identifying the microscopic fractures in their foundation that the world was never meant to see. Every task she performed was a cover for observation. As she gathered the raw data of their insecurities, she realized quickly that the power these families projected was a fragile mask, held in place by performance and deep, unacknowledged misery. Her strategy was rooted in the profound understanding that the system of slavery had created a specific type of psychological rot in the men who sat at its summit. She observed how Jonathan Merrick's eyes lingered on the horizon with a heavy, unspoken loneliness, and how his political success seemed to offer him no genuine warmth. She watched the way Eleanor performed the role of the devoted wife with a cold, of mechanical precision that left her husband starving for a connection that felt authentic. Delilah recognized that the very structure designed to keep her in subjection had also turned her masters into prisoners of their own repressed appetites and social expectations. This was her primary discovery, that the most fortified gates of power were not guarded against the soft, persistent pressure of being truly understood. As the months turned toward autumn, Delilah's presence became a silent, indispensable force within the drawing rooms and libraries where the district's future was decided. She learned to speak the language of the elite, better than they spoke it themselves, using her literacy and poise to blend into the background of their most private moments. While she organized the family's social calendar, she was actually identifying the external pressures that weighed on Jonathan's shoulders, from legislative battles to the simmering envy of his neighbors. She wasn't just a servant waiting for orders, She was a collector of secrets, waiting for the precise moment when a single word could shift the balance of power. The Merrick family felt a growing sense of ease with her nearby, mistaking her quiet focus for loyalty rather than the patient observation of a hunter. By the time the first frost hit the Georgia bottomlands, the trap was already set. Though the Merrick family remained blissfully unaware of their impending ruin, Delilah had successfully positioned herself as the mirror in which Jonathan could finally see the man he wished he was, rather than the politician the world demanded. She understood that by offering him a sanctuary of recognition, she was creating a dependency far more binding than any physical shackle or legal contract. The Trojan horse was now firmly inside the gates, having bypassed the walls of status and race to target the deep, human vulnerabilities of the man in charge. She had identified the exact point where Jonathan's public strength met his private weakness, and she was now ready to apply the surgical pressure that would bring the entire dynasty down. The psychological siege of Jonathan Merrick began not with an act of overt defiance, but with a calculated offering of empathy that felt like a sanctuary. In the flickering candlelight of his study, amidst the heavy scent of tobacco and old parchment, Delilah chose the precise moment to breach the invisible wall between master and servant. She did not use the coarse language of the fields, but a soft, melodic tone that carried the weight of a forbidden truth. By acknowledging the crushing burden of his political responsibilities, she offered him a mirror to his own exhaustion that his wife, Eleanor, had long ignored. This was the first thread of the web, woven with the surgical precision of someone who knew that a lonely man is a vulnerable man. Jonathan, stunned by the sudden intimacy of being truly seen, found himself unable to dismiss the woman who had just validated his soul. Over the following weeks, Delilah cultivated a rhythmic dance of presence and absence that turned Jonathan's mild curiosity into a desperate, gnawing obsession. She moved through the library with a quiet grace, leaving behind a trail of subtle recognition that made the grand rooms of Belle Haven feel smaller and more intimate. Every brief exchange was a masterpiece of subversion, where she spoke just enough to ignite his imagination before retreating back into the shadows of domestic duty. She was teaching him to crave her perspective, positioning herself as the only person in his vast social circle who understood the man beneath the title. Jonathan began to invent excuses to seek her out, convinced that he was merely appreciating her superior intellect while failing to realize he was falling into a carefully laid trap. By the winter of 1838, the emotional dependence had matured into a dangerous proximity that defied the rigid laws of Georgia's social hierarchy. During a quiet weekend, while Eleanor was away in Charleston, the tension that had been building for months finally reached its inevitable breaking point in the silence of the library. Delilah did not plead or seduce in a traditional sense. Instead, she spoke of the tragedy of men who live lives that are impressive from the outside, but hollow within. Her words acted as a key to the rusted lock of Jonathan's heart, granting him permission to vent a lifetime of disappointments and hidden fears. That night, the physical distance between them vanished, but the intimacy was born of a transaction where Jonathan traded his authority for a fleeting sense of peace. The affair moved from the intellectual to the physical in the cramped, dusty confines of the records room, a place where the family's wealth was meticulously documented. In this space dedicated to the cold facts of ownership and property, Delilah effectively flipped the script of possession through the act of surrender. Jonathan believed he was taking what he desired, but in reality, he was surrendering the very leverage that kept him in a position of power. Each secret meeting was a brick removed from the foundation of his reputation, leaving him exposed to a woman who now possessed the most lethal weapon in the South, the truth. As he sat consumed by the dual fires of passion and paralyzing guilt, he realized too late that he had handed his life over to someone he once considered a mere commodity. The final transformation of their relationship occurred when Delilah dropped the mask of the comforting confidante to reveal the cold steel of the strategist. When Jonathan expressed his terror of discovery and ruin, she did not offer him the soft platitudes of a lover, but the hard reality of a captor. She reminded him that his career, his family, and his very standing in society now rested entirely upon her willingness to remain silent and invisible. The dynamic was no longer one of master and slave, but of a prisoner and a jailer who walked through his house in the guise of a servant. Jonathan was now bound to her by a cord of fear that was far stronger than any iron chain could ever hope to be. He was a man drowning in his own choices, while Delilah stood on the shore, finally holding the power to decide if he lived or died. The strategic expansion of Delilah's influence required a new theater of operations, which she found in the ambitious but fractured household of Thomas Thornton. Recognizing that Jonathan Merrick's obsession had become a liability, she engineered a loan of her services to the Riverside estate under the guise of helping with a high-stakes dinner party. Thomas Thornton was a man of commerce and vanity, a stark contrast to the intellectual Merrick, and he represented a different kind of prey for Delilah to dissect. She entered his home not as a simple servant, but as a sophisticated observer who understood that his greatest desire was to be admired without the constant critiques of his social, climbing wife. By shifting her location, she effectively extended her reach, beginning the process of weaving a singular web across the two most powerful families in the entire district. At Riverside, Delilah adopted a new persona tailored specifically to the insecurities of a man who had built his fortune on railroads and textiles, but lacked old-world prestige. Where she had offered Merrick intellectual empathy, she offered Thornton unconditional validation, becoming a quiet champion of his business acumen whenever his wife, Abigail, expressed disappointment in their social standing. She moved through the Thornton household with a calculated efficiency that made her presence seem like a blessing to the overworked Abigail, while secretly creating private pockets of time with Thomas. Each interaction was designed to make the master of Riverside feel like the titan he believed himself to be, fostering a dangerous sense of entitlement and misplaced trust. Thornton, blinded by his own need for ego stroking, failed to see that his new confidante was actually a spy gathering the ammunition for his eventual destruction. The lethal brilliance of Delilah's plan emerged when she began to act as a bridge of misinformation between the two rival planters, feeding their mutual distrust with surgical precision. While maintaining her physical affair with Thornton, she shared accidental discoveries about Merrick's secret attempts to sabotage Thornton's railroad investments and land deals. These were not mere lies, but carefully selected truths she had harvested from the records room at Belhaven, presented in a way that maximized their emotional impact and sparked a cold, vengeful fury. She positioned herself as a reluctant whistleblower, a loyal soul who simply couldn't bear to see her new benefactor being undermined by the man she had previously served. This double dealing turned a professional rivalry into a personal blood feud, ensuring that neither man would ever look beyond each other to find the true source of their ruin. As the autumn of 1838 progressed, the district watched in confusion as the once stable alliance between Merrick and Thornton dissolved into a series of public confrontations and legal battles. Delilah watched from the shadows of the riverside parlors as the two men tore at each other's reputations, each move they made being dictated by the information she had so carefully planted. She had created a closed loop of animosity where every strike Merrick made only drove Thornton further into Delilah's arms for comfort and strategic advice. The power she wielded was now structural. She was the silent conductor of an orchestra of hatred, directing the movements of two powerful families toward a collision that would leave them both shattered. By turning their competitive appetites against one another, she ensured that they were too distracted by their own war to notice her hand on the blade. The final layer of this third keynote involved the quiet recruitment of Marcus Whitfield, the son of the district's third great dynasty, into her growing intelligence network. Marcus carried a secret that was a capital offense in the 19th century South, a hidden identity that Delilah recognized with the same ease she had used to identify Merrick's loneliness. Instead of using seduction, she offered him an alliance based on the mutual safety of their shared knowledge, promising to protect his secret in exchange for the financial vulnerabilities of his father's estate. This expanded her web into a third household without the need for a physical affair, proving that her power was not limited to the bedroom but was a sophisticated form of social and economic warfare. With the Whitfields now compromised, Delilah had successfully triangulated the power of the entire region, setting the stage for the first of the ritualistic deaths. While the white families of the Ogeechee River district believed they lived in absolute privacy, Delilah transformed their perceived isolation into a glass house of constant surveillance. She understood that the very foundation of the plantation system relied on the invisibility of the enslaved, a domestic blindness that allowed her to build an unrivaled intelligence network. Every carriage driver, every laundress, and every field hand became a node in a vast, silent web of information that bypassed the masters entirely. This was not a disorganized group of laborers, but a disciplined collective of observers who saw every late-night visitor and heard every whispered argument. Delilah sat at the center of this shadow government, collecting fragments of truth that no white man would ever share with his equals. By treating the enslaved community as a unified intelligence agency, she possessed a more accurate map of the district's power than the governor himself. The speed and accuracy of this underground telegraph were far superior to the formal letters and newspapers that the planter class relied upon for their news. A scandal whispered in the kitchens of Oakmont would reach Delilah at Riverside before the sun had set, carried by those who moved through the world as invisible labor. She cultivated deep relationships with those who had the most access, such as the enslaved man who cleaned the county courthouse and read the legal filings. This allowed her to know which estates were heavily mortgaged and which men were facing financial ruin long before the banks ever made their move. She taught her contacts what to look for, not just names and dates, but the subtle shifts in mood and the specific anxieties of their masters. This collective memory ensured that no secret remained buried for long, as every indiscretion was logged and reported back to her for future use. The psychological brilliance of this network was its ability to weaponize the deep-seated prejudices of the white elite, who assumed the enslaved lacked the intellect to understand their business. Planters would discuss railroad investments, political betrayals, and illicit affairs right in front of the servants who were pouring their wine or stoking their fires. They spoke as if they were in an empty room, never realizing that the silent woman in the corner was recording every word with a mind as sharp as a razor. Delilah leveraged this arrogance, turning the deaf and dumb stereotype into a tactical shield that allowed her to operate in plain sight. She knew that a man's true character was revealed only when he thought no one was watching, and through her network, she was always watching. This constant stream of raw data allowed her to predict her target's moves and stay 3 steps ahead of any official investigation. Beyond mere observation, this network of shadows served as a mechanism for Delilah to plant the seeds of paranoia and discord throughout the entire region. She would often leak a specific, verifiable piece of information to a house servant at a rival estate, knowing exactly how it would be repeated to the master. This created a cycle of self-fulfilling prophecies, where the white elite began to suspect one another of the very betrayals Delilah had orchestrated. The planters became increasingly erratic, convinced that their peers were conspiring against them, while they completely ignored the true architect of their misery standing in their own hallways. Delilah's network was the ultimate force multiplier, allowing one woman to exert influence over thousands of acres and hundreds of lives without ever raising her voice. It was a silent revolution, fought not with muskets in the woods, but with the terrifying power of accumulated, secret knowledge. By the time the first body was pulled from the river, Delilah's intelligence machine was operating at the peak of its efficiency and lethal potential. She didn't need to be present at every crime scene because she had already choreographed the movements of everyone involved through her proxies. The network provided her with the perfect alibis, the precise locations of her enemies, and the specific psychological triggers needed to drive them toward their own graves. While the sheriff was fruitlessly searching for physical clues, Delilah was already processing the next batch of intelligence regarding the Merrick family's latest vulnerabilities. She had successfully turned the entire district into a laboratory of human behavior, where the masters were the subjects and she was the undisputed scientist. This network was her masterpiece, a testament to the fact that those who are most ignored are often the ones who hold the most power. The ritual of death commenced on a cold March morning, serving as the final, brutal punctuation to Delilah's long and meticulous psychological campaign. Thomas Thornton was the first to fall, his body found tangled in the roots of the Savannah River, a grim spectacle of calculated retribution. The stones tied to his ankles were not merely weights, they were anchors of justice, ensuring his sins remained submerged in the dark water where he died. Most terrifying to the authorities was the single word carved into his cold skin: forgiveness, a message that defied the logic of simple robbery. It was a theological statement, a sign that Delilah viewed herself as a divine instrument tasked with purging the world of these men. By the time the town criers spread the news, the sense of security among the elite had vanished, replaced by a creeping, invisible dread. The investigation led by Sheriff Dye was doomed from its inception because he sought a killer who shared his own masculine and racial biases. He looked for a vengeful runaway or a disgruntled business rival, never imagining that the architect of this horror was serving tea in a nearby parlor. While the law focused on physical evidence and footprints, Delilah was already moving against the second family, the Merricks, using the fallout of Thornton's death to destabilize them. Jonathan Merrick, now unhinged by guilt and the loss of his rival, became a man haunted by the ghost of his own choices and Delilah's silence. She watched his descent with the cold detachment of a scientist, knowing that the fear of exposure was more lethal than any physical weapon. The once grand halls of Belhaven began to feel like a mausoleum, as the second ritualistic death was already being prepared behind closed doors. As the second and third deaths followed with rhythmic, terrifying precision, the district's power structure began to collapse under the weight of its own rot. Each body appeared with the same signature carving, a repetitive ritual that turned the local landscape into a map of Delilah's private, bloody justice. The Whitfields and the Beaumonts, once icons of permanence, found themselves trapped in a web of blackmail and paranoia that they could neither fight nor flee. Delilah did not just kill these men, she dismantled their legacies, ensuring that their names would be forever linked to the award in the water, and the scandal of their hidden appetites. The public was transfixed by the horror, but the enslaved community remained silent, a wall of knowing faces that provided no clues to the white world. The transition of power was complete, as the masters were now the ones living in a state of constant, breathless submission. The ultimate destruction of the four families was not just a matter of mortality, but a total erasure of the social order they had spent generations building. By the time the governor ordered the records sealed, the Merrick dynasty had dissolved, Thornton's estate was in ruins, and the Whitfield line had been effectively severed. Delilah had proven that a single woman, armed with the secrets of her oppressors, could decapitate the leadership of an entire region without ever firing a shot. The great weapon of desire had worked with surgical accuracy, turning the tools of control back upon those who had forged them in the first place. This was warfare conducted in the most intimate spaces, a revolution that took place in the shadows of bedrooms and the silence of libraries. The survivors were left to pick through the wreckage of their lives, forever wondering how the invisible had become so devastatingly powerful. In the end, Delilah disappeared into the folds of history, leaving behind a legacy that was whispered in the cabins, but scrubbed from the official books. She did not seek a crown or a throne. Her satisfaction lay in the absolute proof that she was the most intelligent and capable force in the state of Georgia. The river continued to flow, carrying the secrets of the stones and the carvings, while the white, pillared mansions stood as empty monuments to a defeated era. She had liberated herself through the destruction of her captors, turning the system of slavery into the very trap that swallowed its own masters whole. The story of Delilah remains a dark, Southern Gothic haunting, a reminder that the greatest threat to any power is the person who understands it perfectly. Her name became a warning, a shadow that falls over every history book that tries to tell the story of the Old South.